One thing I like to do after the draft is just play detective a little bit and have a look at what some of the trusted reporters are saying to try and piece together exactly what was going through the Seahawks' mind during the draft. And there's some good information out there, and I want to share some of that today. The first thing I want to highlight is this article with Brady Henderson from ESPN. He is somebody that I would recommend listening to. I think over the years, he's consistently shown that he has got a connection to Seattle's front office. I just get that feeling. I've read enough of his stuff over the years to think that he's got a really good source in there. So when he typically speaks about something after the event, when a bit more information can be revealed, like after a draft, I will always listen to what he is saying. So he wrote an article after the draft saying that what was going through the mind of the team with that number 5 overall pick. He referenced something that was said by John Schneider after the draft, essentially that they were listening to trade offers for the 5th pick. And then he goes on to say they had already decided that they weren't going to move back from the spot if Devon Witherspoon and or one other player were available. He then says the unnamed player was Anderson. That's not speculation. He's stating that as fact. He says that the Alabama outside linebacker briefly looked as though he might fall into Seattle's lap when the Houston Texans took Stroud 2nd overall, creating some fleeting hope in the Seahawks draft room that quickly vanished when Houston traded back up to take Anderson at number 3. So I would suggest that that report and something else that gets mentioned in an article that John Boyle has written that I'm going to come to in a second suggests that, as we were kind of hinting all the way through this process, that Will Anderson was their top guy, that if Will Anderson was going to be there at number 5, he would have been the pick. I think whoever was available there, including any of the quarterbacks, I think they were very much focused on getting a dynamic player and a strong character player and an impact player at number 5. And I always thought that Anderson was their most likely option. And by the sounds of what he's saying here, that was the key. But what he's also saying here is essentially it was Anderson, and then 1B or option 2 was Devon Witherspoon. So he goes on to say, Brady Henderson, that from a pure evaluation standpoint, the Seahawks thought enough of Richardson's talent and potential to take him with the 5th pick. This is Anthony Richardson. But in the bigger picture, for a team that's trying to win now and in a financial pinch, it would have been tough to justify using a pick so high and the money that comes with it on an undeveloped quarterback who'd be a backup for at least a season. So that's what he's saying there. And, I think you have to listen to that. It's not something that, I talked about or gave much credence to, especially the cost factor of that. And that might be a little bit overrated in terms of, if you found a quarterback, if you found the next Patrick Mahomes in this draft, you are not caring one jot about how much you are spending on the position on a guy who's not going to see the field, because you've got somebody that you really believe in. So I don't think that was that much of an issue, but he's raised it here. So maybe it was, or maybe it was simply that they didn't see a quarterback who had that level of talent to warrant that investment. That might be the greater interpretation here. And he's essentially saying that they liked Richardson, but they weren't likely to take him at number 5. And I think from what we've heard, that sounds about right. And this is, obviously I was quite keen on the Seahawks investing in the quarterback position. But I think when you sort of listen to everything they were saying, I remember Pete Carroll was asked, I can't remember whether it was on 710 or whether it was on, the press conference immediately after the first round, when he was sort of asked about, Anthony Richardson. And he was sort of really positive, gushing with, I'm so happy for him. I'm really pleased for him. And I think that Anthony Richardson really, made an impact on Pete Carroll. I think they probably loved, based on everything that's come out, that they love meeting with him, that they liked him as a person, that they think he's got a lot of talent, that maybe in a different situation, let's say if Anderson and Witherspoon were off the board and they couldn't trade down, maybe they would have taken him. I think that was genuine, that Carroll was delighted that he went as high as he did, because he just wants Richardson to succeed and do well, and that he'd gone 4th overall. And that was a good outcome for him at a time when, in the 24 hours leading up to the draft, everyone was suddenly talking about him maybe lasting to pick number 20 for the Seahawks. So he went very high. And I think Carroll was really pleased for Richardson, the man and the player. But I also think because the Seahawks are picking 5th, I suspect that they'd come to this outcome because Carroll's also spoken about how he was like driving down the road the night before and was behind 2 cars with Illinois license plates, and he thought, this is happening, this is happening. It all sounds to me like really it was Will Anderson, top target number 5, more hope than expectation that he was going to be there at number 5. And if he wasn't going to be there, that they felt Devon Witherspoon probably was going to be there and they were going to take him. And what they were probably hoping is that once Stroud went 2, that hope built that Anderson could last, because a lot of people thought Paris Johnson Jr. was going to go to Arizona, and ultimately they did take him. You know, they traded up to number 6 to take him. And I think if Houston weren't so bold to do what they did, then there's every chance that Arizona would have taken Paris Johnson Jr. and that Will Anderson would have lasted to the number 5 overall pick. And the Seahawks would have been ecstatic with that. They'd have got their top target. Instead, they took what was probably their second target in Devon Witherspoon. You know, a lot of people, and look, again, I was very, very up for the Seahawks taking a quarterback. My opinion hasn't changed on that. I'm going to come on to why I think they've thought this in a little bit later on in the video. But I suspect that they were never really focused on quarterbacks number 5, that it was Will Anderson, Devon Witherspoon. They were confident they were going to get one of those guys, and they ultimately get Devon Witherspoon. So let's pivot to the next article that I want to highlight. And this is the one I mentioned a bit earlier, which is on the Seahawks.com website. I would highly recommend checking this out. I think this is fantastic. I love the fact that the Seahawks have done this for the last 2 years, because there's no trade secrets being given away here. There's just a little bit of information that is fairly, it's not going to impact anything. The fact that in this article it's revealed, for example, that Derek Hall had a first round grade and they got him at 37. That there were 4 players after the 16th pick that were on Seattle's board that had first round grades. So they knew they were going to get one at 20 if they stayed and picked. And one of them was Jackson Smith-Njigba, and one of them was Derek Hall. So essentially, from that point of view, I love to hear that kind of stuff, because it goes to show that this draft was a success. That maybe if Jackson Smith-Njigba had gone at, say, the 19th pick instead, they may well have just taken Derek Hall at 20 if they didn't trade down, or they might have been able to trade down a little bit and still get him. Obviously, they would have been able to do that because he was still there at 37. But you get my point. Like, they may have taken him at 20 anyway, and they get him at 37 and Jackson Smith-Njigba. So whatever your personal thoughts were on those players, it worked out very well for Seattle to get those 2 players very early on. And the fact that this talks about that, I think is really cool. They're talking here about, he mentions in the article about how this is John Boyle, great piece, how those sort of first moments were unfolding. Houston picks Alabama outside linebacker Will Anderson, one of the top players left on Seattle's board, along with Witherspoon. So again, it doesn't say that Will Anderson was their top player. He's one of their top players, but I think the fact that it gets mentioned here is indicative again of the fact that they were very high on him. And then there's this as well. The Colts take quarterback Anthony Richardson, the quarterback Carolyn Schneider have spoken very highly of before and after the draft. Again, indicative of their admiration for the player, but perhaps not likely to take him. Perhaps like him enough to be really pleased with that he went number 4 overall, as I've said. One of the other things that's really good in this article is it sort of explains how the later rounds went on. That there was a huge cheer, for example, when Steve Avia was taken by the Rams because they wanted Derek Hall. They were going to get him. I've already mentioned, that was a great pick for them because he had a first round grade, a rare first round grade. It says in this article they had fewer than 20 players with a first round grade. So to get 3 of them when you're picking 5th, 20th, and 37 is a great boon. It makes reference that Keanu Benson was a player that they liked, but wasn't the top player left on their board at 52. And if they were going to stick to the board, what that tells us is if Keanu Benson was there at 52 and Zach Charbonnet was there at 52, then they would have taken Zach Charbonnet. So it was never really a case of, it doesn't sound like they were ever likely to take Keanu Benson, because they would have taken Derek Hall all the way at 37 and they would have taken Charbonnet at 52 because of obviously their grading. Carroll even says here, go with the board. So that's quite interesting. They were apparently trying to trade up from 52, possibly to get Zach Charbonnet. And then, it talks through, there's no information on who was they missed out on, which sort of provoked the desire to trade down from round 3, but it says here, Schneider would explain after the draft that adding picks for next year had been a goal coming into the draft, as they see next year's class as being a strong one. So we got that 3rd round pick, and it's also confirmed it is the lower of Denver's 2 for next year. So Denver have New Orleans as 3rd round pick. I think that's part of the Sean Payton trade. So people have been saying, "Oh, we get to root against the Broncos again next year." You're actually rooting against. You want New Orleans to be picking as high as possible. So you want to root against the Saints. So sorry to disappoint people there. And on the day 3 stuff, it mentions here that the center, whose name escapes me, Jake Andrews, was one of the top centers left on Seattle's board. And when he was taken by New England, this gets a bit of reaction from the room. Jake Andrews had an official 30 visit for the Seahawks. So clearly he was somebody that they were targeting. But John Boyle again noting here that as much as they like him and were perhaps hoping that he'd be there a little bit later on, that the guy they were targeting at number 108 was somebody else. It was Anthony Bradford, the LSU guard, who I thought was really good. I thought it was a 3rd round pick. And they took him there. And I think it was the right thing to do to take him ahead of, if Jake Andrews had been there anyway, I still would have taken Anthony Bradford. So for whatever that's worth, I think that was a good pick. And then you sort of see how they're approaching everything on day 5, taking Cameron Young, stuff like that. It's a really cool piece. I'm not just going to run through all of it. But certainly, that, for example, when they got the Michigan center, it sounded like they were really pleased with that. Go and check that article out. It's a tremendous read, and I'd highly recommend it. And I think you'll have a lot of fun reading that. The other thing that I wanted to bring up here before, I have a few final thoughts on this whole quarterback thing, is I noticed this on Twitter. So this is an article from Tyler Dunn, who runs Go Long, the Substack Go Long, which is where Bob McGinn does his draft pieces. And he's got some sources. Tyler Dunn, he's quite an interesting person. I enjoyed his podcast during the draft, speaking to the Bills' former director of pro personnel, whose name I've forgotten. So he has got some sources. I thought this was really interesting because obviously this is something we've talked about. So he's talking about the Seahawks here. He says they chose Illinois cornerback Devin Witherspoon over Georgia's Jalen Carter. I was told the Seahawks were quite pleased that everybody seemed to view their team as Carter's most logical landing spot. It was never going to happen, says Tyler Dunn. Hell no, one team source said. A few people made a late push for Carter in Seattle's building, but all along, the Seahawks detected polar opposite football DNA in these two prospects, Witherspoon and Carter. Nor were they alone. Multiple teams viewed Carter as unapologetic throughout the pre-draft process, one source said. Bulldogs defensive tackle, of course, raced his Jeep Grand Cherokee against the Ford Expedition hours after his team's championship parade. The Expedition was traveling at about 100 miles an hour when it crashed into a power pole and killed 2 people. Carter initially lied to police about his proximity to the crash. So all I would ask is that when it comes to next year, if there's something similar to this, can we avoid some of the abuse and the nonsense for 3 months? Because this wasn't something, I didn't just sort of wake up one day and decide that I was going to do a couple of videos about the Seahawks aren't going to take Jalen Carter and write an article saying I'm 99.5% convinced they won't take him. That was after conversations with people. It was learning about stuff that did get out in the media in the end. And within some of that stuff that did get out, there's more details that never gets reported because it never does. No one's ever going to go out there and pour everything out that they've heard. But, some of the practice habit stuff and all of that, I heard a lot about all of that. And there was a reason, because they kept spelling it out to us every single time they had a chance to speak about how important character was a year ago in the success of that draft, and that they were trying to build a culture. I spoke to someone who's played in that locker room, what was it, about 2 weeks before the draft or a week before the draft, who said that essentially that, they want to reshape the culture and get the leadership going again. It's why Wagner's back. It's why Jaron Reed's back. They want number 5 pick to play into that as well. And when I was sort of listening to that, when I think back to it now, isn't it obvious that it was going to be Will Anderson or Devin Witherspoon when you actually listen to that? Because with respect, a rookie quarterback who's not playing is not going to come in and add to that sort of leadership value when he's like 3rd string QB Whereas now Devon Witherspoon can. He can immediately become quite a vocal leader if he puts his mind to it. He can do. Will Anderson was always heart and soul at Alabama, so it's pretty clear, what that viewpoint was, that it was all about character. And Jalen Carter, there was just too much there, and we said it for months leading up to the draft. Stayed with it when every single mock draft was predicting that something was going to happen. And let's just remember that for next year. If it doesn't matter if every single national media expert and pretty much every mock had Seattle taking Jalen Carter, every mock, even some of the best sourced journalists in the world for the NFL were convinced. What was Peter King saying? He was saying things like, it's a cliche within the league about the Seahawks taking Carter, that everybody believes it's going to happen. You had all sorts of people. Even Todd McShay, who said he'd heard it didn't happen, ended up changing his mock at the last minute and putting Carter with the Seahawks. So there was clearly a feeling around the league and within the media that was going to happen. But just piece it together. Just piece it together. And it was obvious it wasn't going to happen. And that article confirms it now after the fact. Again, this is what Tyler Dunne reported. I was told the Seahawks were quite pleased that everybody seemed to view their team as Carter's most logical landing spot. It was never going to happen, which is what we said on SeahawksChatBlog.com and on this channel many times. With the quarterback thing, this is it, because people will say, quite rightly, to come back to sort of bring it round full circle to what I was saying at the start about not targeting a quarterback this year. There is still this issue with the fact that Geno Smith is on a prove-it deal, and that's what it is. It's a heavily incentivized contract that he is going to have to earn for next year, because it's about $32 million at the moment just for him to be on the roster next year. And if he doesn't hit any of these incentives, that might be too much. So that's with none of these. There's like 5 incentives that will get it up towards $2 million a piece, that will get it up towards $40 million. It's like, does he get the same number of touchdowns last year? Is the passer rating still the same? Yards, win number of wins is the same or greater. That will get him another $2 million. So if he doesn't tick any of those boxes, I don't think he's going to be worth $32 million anyway. So that's like, that number alone seems unrealistic. He's either going to be earning a lot more than 32, or he's going to be gone. And then it's a case of, how much is going to be too much for Geno Smith. So let's say that he gets the incentive for wins, but it's the defense that really improves. The running game is really good. He has a lot of good weapons. Let's say he throws too many turnovers and it costs the Seahawks a few games that he should win, but they still get to 9, 10 wins because, let's say, the defense and the receivers and the running back and all sorts of stuff like that just are too good for him to fail that badly. What do you do then? Because he's going to get that incentive. What if he matches his touchdown total from last year, gets like 30 touchdowns, but he also throws 20 interceptions? Again, are you going to want to pay this guy $35 million, whatever it's going to be a quarterback next year? So it's really difficult. He either almost has to play lights out and be a real plus point, and then the Seahawks will pay him a fantastic contract for next year. I still think a $40 million contract, people will go, that's compared to Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson and Aaron Rodgers. Well, I still think a $40 million contract is a massive contract. Whether it's comparatively whatever, I still, that's a big contract. I just don't think that the quarterback contracts are realistic these days. I don't think Jalen Hurts' contracts can be value for money, and I don't think Lamar Jackson's is either. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is going to be either. So there we go. Joe Burrow, they'll probably pay him whatever, and he will be worth it. Mahomes is already looking like a bargain. So it's about timing and your nous and what you do with the contract. So, like I say, he's either going to be fantastic, and therefore the Seahawks will happily keep him, or he's not going to be fantastic, and they're going to have a really difficult decision to make about keeping him, which then puts everything into, because Drew Lock's out of contract as well. I mean, technically, they could redo the contract to keep Geno Smith on a lower amount. That's a possibility. They could cut him and re-sign him. That's a possibility as well. There's a lot of different options here. I suspect if it doesn't go well this year and they cut him, I can't see him sort of coming back and having another go at that. And it would be a hard sell to the fan base in that situation if he flounders a little bit. So it's a complicated one. It's just not as simple as they have their quarterback and that's it. We have to see how this year plays out. Obviously, we all hope that he plays lights out and that $40 million seems like an absolute drop in the ocean for him because he plays fantastically well, plays like he did in that first half of last season throughout the whole year. But the worry is that the second half of the season happened, and is he going to be able to avoid that happening again? And if it does happen, can it be a couple of games, 3 games sporadically, or is it going to be a run? We'll wait and see. But the Seahawks do have to have a plan at quarterback, and the fact that they haven't drafted anybody this year, and they haven't got anybody being developed. People say, "Oh, Drew Lock's a development." Well, yeah, but you can't. How much of a development is that? I mean, if Geno Smith fails this year and it holds the team back, are you really going to be able to turn around to the fans and go, "Yeah, that guy who was backing up Geno Smith and didn't beat him out? Yeah, we're going to give him a try now." I mean, that you're getting into the territory there of Colts, of sort of having a good roster, a roster capable of doing something, and constantly just churning through inadequate quarterbacks until you end up having to take a gamble on somebody fourth overall, which I think Chris Ballard is essentially saying that Richardson's amazingly talented, but it is a gamble because he's going to have to start right away probably, and most people would accept that he's probably not ready for that. So it is a gamble, and the Seahawks don't want to get themselves into that situation. But that's where they're at if this goes somewhat poorly. And I think that you've got to, if it goes well, even then with 2 years of Geno, I still think when he's going to be like 34 next year, you've got to be thinking about the future. I know people say, "Oh, he's not played that much football, so he can play until he's 40 odd." I mean, look, just nature just takes its toll on your body. It doesn't matter whether you've played one NFL game or 100. You do get old, and things happen to your body when you get old. I am 38. I have never played in the NFL. Going to the gym today offers challenges that it didn't offer when I was 32. So, and look, I know I'm not a professional athlete, but the point is that your body just gets older and it acts differently, and you have to adjust. And it's not always easy to, I wouldn't assume that Geno's going to be able to play for another 5 years. I think having somebody drafted and ready to go is a good idea from next year. Now, it doesn't mean you force it, which is what they've not done this year, and I applaud them for that if they didn't have to be rated high enough to take. So you don't force this and draft someone for the sake of it, but they've got to start thinking about drafting somebody to have them developing in the background. If nothing else, to be like the Jordan Love for the future who plays in 3 or 4 years' time, to have them sort of knowing the system, knowing the receivers, knowing the team, knowing the coaches, all of that stuff, so that they can make the smoothest possible transition and not have to just chuck a rookie in there like the Colts are doing with Anthony Richardson. And that's partly why I think John Schneider is talking the way he did about getting extra draft stock. I think he is looking at the depth of the quarterback class next year, because all of the middle class returns to school, like pretty much everybody, apart from DTR and Tanner McKee, everybody else returned to school. Some of them transferred and some of them stayed where they are. But ultimately, all of the players that you'd expect to go between rounds 2 and 4, who were being projected there, went back to school. And it really cut down on the options. Jim Nagy talked about how it impacted the Senior Bowl when I interviewed him. And I spoke to somebody in the league, and they were saying that basically the whole middle class is gone. You've got the top 5, and then you've got 6th and 7th rounders. That was his view. Obviously, some players went before 6th and 7th round, but ultimately that's what he thought, and I think that's what the Seahawks thought as well. So there's going to be a lot more options next year. I don't think they acquired stock to go and get Caleb Williams. I think they acquired stock so that they could move around, maybe round 1, move a few spots, round 2, round 3, move around, do what they need to do to get a guy that they like. And I think they feel comfortable that they will identify someone that they can like. And it might be a raw prospect who they can bring in and work behind Geno Smith or somebody next year, and they can work on them over 2 or 3 years, but it might not necessarily be a first-round pick. It could be a second or a third-round pick. And that's fine. And look, and I've already watched a lot of these players. Go on SeahawksDraftBlog.com for my analysis on your Quinn Ewers, your Caleb Williams, your Drake Mays, your Michael Penix Juniors. I've done a whole bunch of research already. I've watched every game that Quinn Ewers has ever played for Texas and the spring game. So I've been hammering the tape already. I've got a whole bunch more to watch this summer. I can't wait to get stuck into it. I can't wait for the college football season already. I'm already counting down the days to September. But there's options there for Seattle to take a quarterback to develop next year. And if they need one to start, there may be some options there as well. We'll have to see how it goes. But that's what I think their plan is. I think there's a little bit of anxiety about John Schneider. You know, I think he's frustrated that he's been in the job since 2010 and he's only drafted 2 quarterbacks. And one of them was a throwaway pick in the 7th, and Alex Magoo. I think he felt like when that Russell Wilson trade happened, that he probably would draft a quarterback in the next 2 years. And that hasn't happened. I don't think the plan was ever just hope that Geno Smith works out or Drew Lock. I think they had bigger plans than that, and they just haven't materialized, and they've gone in a different direction. Now, the one thing is the roster looks in a good place. It still, I think, needs another off season. It still, I think, needs another impact defensive lineman in there to sort of really project it. I don't think they're going to be able to get that player this year. The best they can hope for is to find a way to save some money, possibly with talking to Jamal Adams about lowering his salary. And I would hope that 2 parties can do that, given he's not done anything last season. You know, try and get a bit more money available to go and get somebody in. But they're not going to get an impact player at this point, I don't think. And I really hope they're not going to go down the road of trading for rentals again, which is what they used to do. That never worked. It never worked. So, but then it won't work if they start the season 5 games, the defense giving up hundreds of yards in the running game and the passing game again, which has happened the last few years. But I still don't want them to go and start chasing rentals for a year. If there's the right deal for a young player who's maybe got 2 or 3 years on his contract left, fine. But they don't have money to spend to go and make big splashes anyway. And yeah, so I just don't think that's very likely. So I think they need another off season, but the offense looks fantastic. Very few holes in the offense now. Defense, cornerback looks strong. They have linebackers. They have edge rushers. They have invested heavily in the safety position, rightly or wrongly. And they have some defensive linemen in Draymond Jones and John Reed. And I really like Cam Young. I'm intrigued by Mike Morris. They've got some bodies in there that are interesting. There's probably just that little bit of depth and competition for Cam that's missing. So still got some work to do. But I do think at some point next year they're going to draft a quarterback. And I think this is going to be the year to sort of study the guys. And like I say, I don't think it'll necessarily be a top guy, but I do think they're going to take one. And look, it's not. I'm not a Husky fan. I don't follow any college football team, so please don't accuse me of bias. But I do think they're generally going to have a lot of interest in Michael Penix Jr. He's got the arm. I think the way he falls away from his throws bothers me, but it seems to work for him. And maybe he's just got a quirk to his technique, but it works. And his arm is fantastic. He's just got a gorgeous arm. And he's got the kind of character that I think would fit this locker room. So I think he's somebody to keep an eye on. John Schneider's already talking about Quinn Ewers. He's kind of got that alpha mentality. He's got wonderful release. He's got some of the physical tools. But his tape's pretty crap, to be honest. So he needs to take a big step forward this year. And he's going to have to handle that with all the pressure of Arch Manning in the background. So, guys like that, I think are sort of interesting to watch and sort of project and follow throughout the year. But there's a whole bunch of them. And we're going to talk about every single one on SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Don't forget to like the video. Leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video. Until next time, bye for now.